So today, we're going on a bit of a journey. We're going to step off the well-worn path of Western thought and expand our map of what it means to be human. We'll explore some absolutely massive ideas from around the globe and see just what we might have been missing.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the standard map. Most of us are given. Then we'll dig into why we need to look beyond its borders, beyond that Eurocentric view. We're going to unearth the forgotten science from the Arab world, tackle the huge debate of individual versus community from an East Asian perspective, and then dive into a philosophy of liberation born out of struggle in Latin America. And finally, we'll put it all together and see what our new, much more complete worldview looks like.
All right, so let's start on familiar ground. When you hear the words political philosophy, who are the first thinkers that pop into your head? Seriously, take a second. Chances are you thought of names a lot like these. And for good reason. These are the heavy hitters of the Western intellectual tradition. I mean, their ideas about justice, power, and society have fundamentally shaped the world we live in. They form the bedrock of what most of us learn in school. They are, you could say, the major landmarks on our standard map of thought.
But what if that map, as detailed and important as it is incomplete? What if it only really shows one continent of thought? To understand why we need a bigger map, we have to understand the history of how this one was drawn. Wow, this quote from the 19th century French philosopher Ernest Renan is, well, it's pretty jarring to read today. But it captures a mindset that was incredibly dominant in Europe at the time. The idea was that conquest wasn't just about grabbing land or resources, it was a moral duty, a vocation, to rule over and supposedly civilize the rest of the planet.
And this wasn't just a one-off opinion. It was a whole system of thought, a powerful narrative we now call colonialist discourse. It basically created a story where one part of the world was the center of all history and progress, and everyone else was just waiting on the sidelines. This is the intellectual climate that led to one map being seen as the only map that mattered.
So, in response to that, a whole new way of thinking emerged: post-colonialism. You can think of it as a way to reread history, but this time from the perspective of the colonized, not the colonizer. It forces us to ask tough questions about power and about whose stories got told and whose were erased. And that's exactly what we're going to do right now. We're going to go looking for some of those other stories.
All right, let's chart our first new territory. We're going way back to the 14th century, to North Africa, to meet a thinker who was, frankly, centuries ahead of his time. His name is Ibn Khaldun, and some people call him the true father of sociology and the study of history itself. So what Ibn Khaldun did was pretty revolutionary. You see, before him, history was all about checking your sources. Was the guy telling the story an honest, trustworthy person? But Ibn Khaldun came along and said, whoa, hold on, that's not enough. We need to ask a much bigger, more fundamental question. Is the story itself even possible in the real world? To test this new method, he took a historical claim that everyone just accepted as fact. For centuries, people had passed down the story of Moses leading this massive army of 600,000 men. It came from trusted sources, so nobody really questioned it.
But Ibn Khaldun hit the pause button. He stepped back and asked a simple but absolutely devastating question that nobody else had thought to ask. He wasn't challenging the faith of the story, he was challenging the physical, logistical reality of it.
And this is where you see his new science in action. He uses pure reason and evidence. First, he points out that geographically there's no way the region could have fed an army that big. Second, from a military perspective, trying to command and move that many people would be an absolute nightmare. And third, he uses a comparison. The Persian Empire, one of the mightiest on earth, never had an army bigger than a third of that size. His conclusion? The number had to be an exaggeration. He was using social and environmental science to fact-check history. Just brilliant.
Okay, from the science of society, let's jump over to East Asia to explore a really fundamental difference in how we see ourselves. A debate that has huge implications for politics and culture even today.
So let's break this down because it's a huge contrast. On one side, you've got the classic Western liberal idea of the self. Here, you're an independent agent, and the goal of life is to choose your own path, your own values. But on the other side, you have the communitarian view, which is really influential in many East Asian cultures. Here, the self isn't separate from the community, it's part of it. A good life isn't about choosing everything, but about finding your place and honoring your role within your family, your community, your nation.
And look, this isn't just some abstract idea from a textbook. This quote from Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's first prime minister, shows how this philosophy gets put into practice. He's making the case that a focus on the group, on communal harmony, isn't a bug.
It's a feature. It's a source of strength that, he argues, works better for their society.
And this table really brings it home. In the real world, different rights sometimes clash, and you have to decide which one comes first. In a place like the US, individual rights like free speech are often seen as the top priority, sometimes even over collective economic rights. But in China, the priority is often flipped. Collective rights, like ensuring widespread economic development for the whole society, can take precedence over certain individual political freedoms. It's not that one side denies the other rights exist. It's about what you prioritize when you can't have both.
All right, for our next stop, let's head to Latin America. This is a region where, for more than 500 years, philosophy hasn't just been an academic exercise. It's been forged in the fire of conquest, colonialism, and the constant fight for liberation.
You know, this philosophy wasn't dreamed up in some quiet university library. It was born out of real-world struggle. And as you can see from this timeline, it started right away, in the 16th century, with these intense debates over the very humanity of indigenous peoples. Later, in the 19th century, it was about taking ideas like socialism and adapting them for local revolutions. And by the 20th century, you have thinkers like Frantz Fanon digging into the psychology of colonialism itself. This is a philosophy that has always been tied to action.
Let's zero in on that first moment, the big debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda. I mean, this was a showdown for the ages. On one side, you had Sepulveda, who used classical philosophy to argue that some people were just natural slaves and that the Spanish conquest was totally justified. But on the other side was Las Casas, a friar who had actually lived in the Americas. He fought back, fiercely defending the full humanity and intelligence of indigenous peoples and condemning the horrific violence of the conquistadors. This single debate basically set the stage for centuries of conflict over justice and rights in the Americas.
So, after our journey through North Africa, East Asia, and Latin America, where does that leave us? Well, what we've done is started to sketch out a new, much fuller, much more interesting map of human thought.
Now, the point here isn't to just throw out the Western canon. Not at all. It's about putting it into a global conversation. When you layer Ibn Khaldun's social science and the communitarian ethics of East Asia and the liberation philosophy from Latin America onto the map we already have, you don't just get more information. You get a richer, more three-dimensional, and honestly, a much more accurate picture of our shared human quest for meaning.
And that, really, brings us to the final and most important point. This is just the beginning. Expanding our map is a project that never really ends. It challenges every single one of us to keep asking, whose voices are still missing from this conversation? What huge continents of thought are still unexplored on my own personal map? The world of ideas is so much bigger than any one tradition. The real adventure is to never stop exploring it. Thanks for joining me.